Mark, you were talking about, like the effect of some chemical pesticide, harmful effect on farmers' health, on environment. We'll get back to you, but before that, I would like to ask Mr. Robert, climate change has become a critical issue in Bangladesh and in other developing countries, particularly like the most affected vulnerable countries. And now we are talking about agricultural transformation. The whole system needs to be transformed. We talk about resilience. We talk about relief to resilience, where you need to sustain within the system. So where we actually are now relying on the resources and what capacity we have for coming days to tackle all the challenges.
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. Climate change isn't just an issue of agriculture. Climate change is probably the challenge of our generation. And we're on a critical moment, as our Secretary General of the United Nations has said in his last 2 years of his annual addresses. Climate change and climate issues are the most pressing issue to humankind that we're facing at this moment. This said, we also had helped organize, FAO helped organize the Food System Summit in October of 2021 and November of 2021 when it was organized in New York. Within this context, it was made remarkably clear that agriculture and our food systems account for upwards of 30% of all global greenhouse gases that are produced. This is a massive impact on climate change. As well, it was recognized that our food systems are no longer necessarily fit for purpose. And this ties in to your earlier question about 8 billion people on the planet and assuring food security and nutrition security for all 8 billion people.
See, it's a bit of paradoxical. I mean, on one hand, we need more produce, and on the other hand, there would be some sort of consequence where we'll have effect on the environment.
Well, so you can look at it as a paradox or a contradictory challenge, but it doesn't have to be. It can be a recognition of the interrelatedness of all the things that we do to survive on the planet. And producing our food doesn't have to be a high global impact. So we look at, as you pointed out, the different areas of climate resilience, which is adapting to climate change. And so this is new rice varieties that can be grown in saline environments or using vertical gardening to use a smaller geographic space to produce more food, more efficient ways of irrigating through buried pipes and solar systems instead of using diesel for pumping water. These are all ways of adapting to that scenario, but we can also mitigate. And there's different mitigation areas of using wet-dry systems of rice production that reduces methane gas, producing milk more efficiently, so you have less methane from the cattle industry. So there's a lot of different ways that we can transform our agriculture sector to ensure that we produce more, safer, and higher quality food without necessarily having negative impacts on our immediate environment, but also the climate.
And we might need to look into the economical benefit of the smallholder. Because if we talk about Bangladesh, then smallholder farmers are the only producer in our country mostly. So Mark, Robert was mentioning about safer ways of producing food. And when we talk about climate change, sometimes we see that newer pests are coming forward, like new disease and other things. And people don't mind, many of the farmers, technically, they don't follow the proper instruction of using pesticide and harmful pesticide, which might have negative impact on human health and environment. So do you think that things might need to change in coming days and farmers need to follow, better practice? We talk about good agriculture practice, we talk about IPM, newer tools are coming forward like pest resistant crop, genetically modified crop, gene editing, all these things are together. But do you think that can Bangladesh learn from all these, issues that we are having, and do you have actually enough skill and capacity to move ahead?
Capacity is definitely there. And these issues, as Robert has already said, are not unique to Bangladesh. They apply to farmers around the world. It's important to recognize, first of all, that pest management in agriculture is integral to crop production. So if you have a resilient crop that's being grown, it will be more resilient to pests and diseases in the same way as it is resilient to the impacts of climate change, for example. So you need to look after the soil, you need to look after the environment to make sure that resilience is there. Now, a healthy crop in a healthy environment will require fewer pesticides. And I think what the direction that Bangladeshi as well as other farmers need to be taking is to have a better understanding of the ecosystem in which they are operating. Growing crops is part of the natural process. It depends on natural systems such as soil nutrition, such as irrigation, water, rainfall, whether it comes naturally or whether it comes from an irrigation system. So plants need to be well nourished, well irrigated, the soil needs to be in good condition, and all of these things depend on farmer knowledge. So we have to first of all acknowledge that the farmers are experts in their own right, but also give them the tools and the information that they need to be able to help their crops be more resilient to climate change as well as to pests and diseases. Pest management itself, there's an almost automatic reaction. If there's a pest in the field, let's use a chemical. It doesn't have to be a chemical. There are many, many other ways of dealing with pests. We can deal with pests through cultural controls. For example, you can select resistant varieties of crops. You can plant them in ways that help them to resist diseases or certain...
Or crop rotating, another thing might be beneficial.
Absolutely, rotations and so forth. All of these things help to prevent pests and diseases in crops. And farmers know these things and need to be advised and reminded that these are good practices. Then there are mechanical controls. You can use pheromone traps, for example, where you're not spreading pesticides in the field, but you're bringing the pests to the pesticide.